Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about social tokens. What are they? Current and future applications in gaming. And just to speak really honestly, I think many, if not most, game developers are skeptical of anything blockchain and crypto related. And I was part of that group for a very long time. So most recently, I've kind of come around to seeing some of the potential applications, and we could talk about some of the reasons for that. But with us to speak about blockchain and social tokens is Richard Kim, a partner at Galaxy Interactive and actually an investor in my game studio, Lila Games. Welcome, Richard.
Hey, Joe.
And maybe just to start off, do you want to do a brief introduction in terms of who you are and Galaxy Interactive?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a GP at Galaxy Interactive with my partner, Sam. And over the last 2 years, we've been one of the most active gaming VCs who are entirely sector focused. We have around 50% of our portfolio in interactive content, another 25% in interactive tech, and another 25% in interactive social, which we see as the collision, the combination of gaming on the one hand and consumer and social more broadly on the other. I'd say that we obviously have a lot of knowledge and expertise about the gaming sector, but we're not exclusively focused on gaming. I think our real edge is in understanding how gaming is going to intersect with markets, with finance, with social, and with tech in really interesting and explosive ways, which will be most of the topic of this conversation in terms of the intersection of Web3 and everything happening there with gaming.
All right. So I thought we could start by just talking to the audience about social tokens itself. Like, what is it? Could you describe to the audience what exactly a social token is, and maybe in the broader context of how it, of like blockchain, crypto, and where social tokens fit in?
Mm-hmm. So in October of last year, I wrote this article called "From Nothing to Something" with RNG, and I started this social experiment that we call RNG. To really explore this idea of, can you create a community-owned virtual currency out of nothing? Like, can you create a sustainable ecosystem out of that? And, it's one thing to debate these things intellectually. And one of the things I hate the most, to be honest, is getting into intellectual debates about blockchain and gaming with particularly folks from the gaming industry, just because there's just frankly too much talk in the space and not enough action. And so I wanted to kind of, not be one of those talkers and actually be a doer in the space. And so in October, what we did was we created a Discord community called RNG and tied it to a social token, which is specifically, if you're familiar with crypto, it's what's called an ERC20 on the Ethereum blockchain. And, there's infrastructure companies. In this case, we used Roll. I think their website's tryroll.com, where, our users didn't have to have MetaMask or any understanding of blockchain whatsoever. But, using traditional Web2 logins, they could receive a wallet, receive this social currency, and use that to essentially participate in this Discord that had authentication gates based on how much of the crypto you owned, and kind of engagement rewards linked to, how active you were in the Discord and what games you completed, et cetera, et cetera. And, the whole point of doing this was, I'd been hearing from the crypto crowd quite a bit that you just like tokens were like magic fairy dust, right? You just sprinkle some on any community and you boost engagement and retention by 10x. And I was like, that sounds too good to be true. But I had to test it out, right? And there's a real problem statement here, and it's less rooted in gaming, but more in the creator economy generally, which is I had just read this creator economy market map from SignalFire that laid out the kind of 3 layers of evolution of the creator economy, starting from the foundational media platforms like YouTube, Instagram, et cetera, in layer 1. And then the shift to monetizing influencer reach once creators started building a brand. This layer 3, where we are today, of creators as businesses, which you see in companies like Substack and others that enable those with fans to monetize their fans better. And after looking at the 100+ companies in that piece, I was really surprised that no one was working on what seemed to me to be an obvious layer four, this idea of user-governed communities. And I, um, I was kind of sick, especially after talking to so many esports companies, esports teams, that were all like obsessed with this idea of how can we monetize our fans better. It was a very kind of extractive dimension that I thought should be kind of pivoted to this idea of how can we reframe the creator collective relationship entirely so that fans could get shared upside for being early participants in the communities that they so avidly advocated for. And so last October struck me as a perfect time to start experimenting with this stuff and actually try to build the equivalent of a Soho house, right? Except instead of charging people membership fees, why don't we give away 80% of the Soho house, have it run entirely on tokens, have the earliest members not only get in for free, but effectively become jump ball members of a decentralized collective and see what happens, right? And I certainly didn't go into it like having all the answers, but it's been a tremendous learning experience 6 months in that I've written about quite extensively. And it's funny, those first few weeks, you almost feel like God, like dropping this virtual currency on everyone, and everyone's like doing these crazy engagement related things to get it. And it's not just like funny money, right? Because the amazing thing about cryptocurrency is that it's fungible. And when you intersect that with decentralized finance, which has come an incredibly long way over the last year and a half, like if you want to look at one of the most mind-blowing charts you'll ever see, there's a website called defipulse.com. You can see the value locked under smart contracts in the Ethereum blockchain has gone from $1 billion in June 2020 to around $44 billion today. And this is not just like crypto funny money. This is like real like dollar equivalents locked in self-executing contracts on Ethereum and supporting things like decentralized exchange, lending, and all these things that really they're important to gaming, because when you take the fungibility and exchangeability and composability of a cryptocurrency and you use some of these protocols to be now for the first time able to exchange some of these things for real value, like upfront, it's a tremendously powerful primitive in bringing open markets to what were previously kind of like largely closed economies, right? And so, in terms of like what the successful social token communities are these days, like I would say that Whale is probably the biggest one right now. And every one of these communities has to stand for something, right? And the analysis of what gives a token value is it's gonna be the same no matter what token you're talking about, right? It's just supply and demand ultimately. And part of demand is what can I do with this thing? There's certainly the access gate dimension of if I assemble, like going back to my Soho House example, like if I assembled a really cool crowd, there's a membership fee, right? And people get that, right? But what aside from a membership fee can this do? Like why else would I acquire this thing? And then you start to get into some of the kind of virtual currency like use cases of social tokens, whether that's buying digital art from creators in the community or powering games created by the community using that social token. You need to create some of these sources of demand, right? And in the case of Whale, one of the amazing things they've done is it's probably the biggest community of digital artists in a space that's exploding right now with the growth of NFTs generally. And what they've done is gain mindshare as essentially beta to the top tier of NFTs and digital art, which is an entirely separate topic that we can talk about for an hour. But my point here is you have to stand for something, and so Whale is beta to NFTs. What is RNG? Like, still figuring it out. And one of the reasons why I haven't taken the steps to make RNG that liquid on these decentralized finance markets is so that we have the flexibility to kind of learn as we go and just organically figure out things as we go along. But the interesting point is, if someone wanted to list RNG on one of these markets, I couldn't stop them, right? And that kind of permissionless innovation and building on top of these communities is probably the most interesting part of it.
Okay, so like in terms of social tokens, I understand like you're doing something very practical with RNG. And in terms of a game developer, as far as what they can do with their communities using social tokens, how should game developers be thinking about the application of social tokens in their games or for their user communities?
So I would say social tokens are a pretty advanced application of crypto primitives.
Okay.
And so as I think about the continuum of games today, right? So most games, like almost all games, have virtual currencies. And these virtual currencies are kind of closed within the context of that game, right? And that's very important to balance the economy and make sure the game designer can do all the things that they want to, right? As the kind of sole market maker and supplier of these things. What's interesting is you can take gradual steps towards making your game open, right? And the benefit of making it's not the case that open is good and closed is bad. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But there is a set of games mainly revolving around the collection space, like where you have collectibles involved.
Right.
I mean, especially mobile developers will be familiar with like gotcha mechanics and this sort of thing, right? So you bring that to the idea of digital collectibles and the ability to suddenly trade these collectibles on open markets that the developer doesn't have to build themselves because they already exist because of that fungibility aspect that I described earlier, right? And that's where you get potentially really interesting and powerful applications. So I would say the layer one of getting involved in the blockchain space, if you're a game developer, is at the cosmetics layer. It's hard to make functional virtual goods. It's hard to put them on the blockchain without losing some really important control over game balance and game economy and this sort of thing, right?
Right. So
but imagine
just to clarify for our audience, so what you're suggesting is that one of the things that game developers can do is to not risk their economy with, basically they've got a system of sources and sinks and things of that nature. But if they just started with a cosmetics-based layer, in this case, would they be using social tokens or would they be using NFTs to power the cosmetics?
Yeah, these are NFTs. And, then you have to ask some basic infrastructural questions like which blockchain, is the blockchain going to be scalable enough to support my issuance volume of NFTs, all this sort of thing.
Right.
And we can talk about that in detail later on. But I'd say it's striking to me that I haven't seen, and I know some are working on this right now, but to date, I can't name you a single mainstream blockchain game that has their virtual goods layer, even pure cosmetics, on a blockchain, right? And so it goes to kind of my point of, so many people think they understand blockchain and its application to gaming, but how can you if you haven't even seen in the wild what happens when you combine a mainstream game with these open market tradable primitives that give you Top Shot like effect. So NBA Top Shot has sold over $250 million, close to $300 million now. And it's not surprising to me at all, right? Because you combine those core collection mechanics with open market tradability. And of course, people are going to go bonkers over this stuff, right? It's become a cultural phenomenon. So that's layer one. And I wouldn't say shift your entire cosmetics layer to blockchain on day one, but do controlled experimentation, right? You could have most of your skins as they are, but sell one of 5 editions of an NFT skin, and then see what happens. Maybe no one cares.
Okay. So just to clarify, it seems like when we're talking about blockchain and crypto, that first step, probably the first applications that you're suggesting that we're likely to see are going to be more around NFTs rather than social tokens, and will probably be an application in gaming that doesn't impact the economy. So to cosmetics, but then in terms of social tokens itself, in the ability for game developers to utilize social tokens, what are, and again, maybe this is more theoretical, but what are some of the potential theoretical applications of social tokens in your opinion?
So here's where I'm getting to kind of personal opinion stage, but here's what I think is not going to work. A traditional game developer with their own economy, with the kind of 1 to 5 virtual currencies, and them kind of saying, hey, let's build a social token and create something out of nothing and use it to create value that wouldn't otherwise exist, get influencers to market our game and do all these things and basically treat this thing as cash without paying for it, right? And the reason I don't think that works is it's like a recursive problem, right? You have to ask, what is the source of demand for this thing? So you can give it away to influencers or whoever, and there may be some interest in it, but then ultimately you're going to have to ask the question, what can I do with this thing? Right. There has to be endogenous sources of demand, right, within the ecosystem you're creating. So one thing that could be interesting is if you created a fungible virtual currency, like a cryptocurrency, i.e. social token, that you send out to influencers and others who are kind of using your game, or community members that are, adding a lot of value or whatever, right? Your most engaged players, et cetera. And you send it out and it's redeemable for things like skins, right? And only redeemable using that social currency, right?
Got it.
So that could be an interesting kind of intermediate take of social tokens. At the extreme end of the spectrum, and where I'm personally most excited in terms of how transformational and TAM creating social tokens can be, is the idea of fundamentally reworking your notion of ownership and economy in game, which means all those traditional virtual currencies you had in that closed ecosystem, you don't have it anymore. You rework your entire economy and governance and community structure around these social tokens. It would be the equivalent of like Epic Games not existing and a kind of ragtag group of developers, artists, programmers, et cetera, coming together and saying, there will only be V-Bucks. And everything we do is organized around engendering value to V-Bucks. And, we'll still charge for skins in dollars, and we'll only ever issue, say, 10 million V-Bucks. And what's going to happen over time as your player base scales is the price in V-Bucks of your skins is going to fall, right? Because V-Bucks get increasingly valuable because more and more people are going to want them, and you're keeping the dollar price of skins constant, right? So that type of mentality shift is where social tokens get really interesting. And I'm seeing some of that experimentation today in the blockchain gaming space, the much criticized blockchain gaming space. Mm-hmm. And the user experience is still atrocious. But if you kind of see past that, you see glimmers of things that are really, really interesting. There was a Tamagotchi kind of game that launched earlier this week called Avegachi. And honestly, the onboarding experience was one of the most painful things I've ever gone through, because you have to deal with side chains on Ethereum and all this kind of conversion and DeFi complexity, blah, blah, blah. But it was really interesting because, this game was governed, or was built from the ground up to be governed by what's called a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, i.e. the player base. And all the sources of value are constructed so as to deliver value to the token as the lifeblood of this entire ecosystem. And the token is really integrated with decentralized finance protocols in ways that, this is just an open market game, and combined with very basic collection primitives. And so as I think about okay, what is the future of where blockchain games get really interesting? It's in games that are architected from the bottoms up to be governed by their player base and to have all of the sources of value delivered into the token itself, and to have that token be natively integrated into all the latest decentralized finance protocols. And why is this important? Because today, let's use Roblox as an example. There's obviously a huge creator developer base around Roblox, but it's very difficult to get fiat into and out, not so much into, but more out of the system, right? Because, if you're a developer and you're facilitating real money exchange with virtual currencies, you fall under things like money transmission laws and FinCEN guidance on what it means to be a virtual currency issuer that requires you to do things like KYC and AML checks. I think that space is the most interesting space that we're going to see a lot of innovation in blockchain gaming space, but it's also one that's fraught with a lot of issues primarily from a legal and regulatory standpoint, that need to be carefully considered.
And so for game developers that are thinking about just blockchain generally, and you mentioned NBA Top Shots, that they've obviously done really well, but what are good examples of both games that have, and I guess NBA Top Shot isn't so much a game, it's more of NFT art to some degree, right? But do you have examples of the specific, whether it's game or applications, that game developers should be watching, both from a blockchain perspective and then in terms of social tokens? Or do you think social tokens is, as you mentioned, because of some of the challenges, that's going to be further off in the future?
Yeah, so if you think of blockchain gaming as like the kind of spectrum of innovation towards open markets gradually, right? I think the first like breakout hits are likely to be games. I'll just plug our own portfolio company for a second. Mythical Games is developing a game called Blankos,
Right.
blankos.com, and it's like a really it's like a really fun party game that is just genuinely like stands by itself as a game first and foremost. So that's super interesting. Except they're making the cosmetics layer essentially subject to open markets and tradable, and tapping into some of the same inherent collection and trading desires that you see in something like Top Shot with its $300 million of sales. So I think that combination of a great game experience and kind of a UGC-driven world where players can express their creativity, so there's a lot more utility for cosmetics, combined with open market trading and the ability to list, skins on eBay and have them go through PayPal and all these things. Like, I'm really excited about that over the next year. So that's kind of like the kind of short to medium term, right? Over the longer term, I think even more excited about games that flip the ownership model on its head fundamentally, right? So Mythical Games, which makes Blankos, is a traditionally organized company that received venture funding from us and others, just like any other company. And sure, they've made this kind of cosmetics layer that's tradable on a blockchain, and that's interesting. And I think we're going to see some really great results there. But it's still a centralized company, right? So what happens if instead you architect your experience so that there's not even a company, right? That all of the value goes into this decentralized collective. And it's easy to dismiss this because the user experience has not been great up to this point, but the amount of development and the pace of innovation you see in open economies that are fundamentally that open in nature, right? I'll give you an example of a permissioned open economy. It's the Steam marketplace. And like, this is one argument I hear against blockchain a lot is, well, Steam marketplace, like, it's kind of the same thing and it's on a single database, so you don't need blockchain, right? But what you don't have with something like the Steam marketplace is that kind of incentive for an entire ecosystem to build on top of, your core protocol, knowing that the rules of the game aren't going to change halfway in, that they can't just be shut off anymore. In fact, like, no one owns this stuff because they're all self-executing contracts on the blockchain. And that kind of split in ownership, governance, and economics is something I think 99.9% of traditional game developers I met really struggle with. And so I don't think we're going to see traditional game developers leading the charge on this stuff. I think it's actually going to be people with more of a crypto background figuring out how to get Reddit place type of emergent, like the emergent horde, like bringing them together in really unexpected ways. That's interesting, like almost flash mob style.
And maybe we could talk a little bit more about social tokens applied to organizational structure. And this is something we talked about on Clubhouse earlier this week. But for example, one of the interesting things that I've been noticing on Roblox is that the kind of projects that come together and the creators that are developing on Roblox are kind of dynamically organizing around different projects. And it's like there's some type of lead who then attracts an audience of creators, and then they will form these ad hoc groups to work on a specific game project. And my theory behind why that is occurring is because Roblox has basically commoditized a lot of the infrastructure so that you don't need a big organized kind of team to do a lot of the work. And because creators can build a lot easier, they're able to kind of form these kind of groups, but you then don't have like that formalized organizational structure, like a Delaware C Corp, with a cap table, all that kind of thing. And so the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and maybe you can talk to our audience about, is not only social tokens in terms of a layer of exchange between creator and community, but also as potentially a way of being like an organizational glue, or a way of being like a project-based token against like a game project or something like that. Could you speak to the potential of social tokens in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've now touched on at least two functions of social tokens, right? Yeah. One is as currencies, and apply your traditional virtual currency rubric to that in terms of supply, demand, faucets, and things, right? Then the second being like tokens as kind of status symbols in a community and access gates, and exclusive rewards. I think people get that as well. There's a third function that's pretty interesting, which is tokens as essentially like jump ball equity in a decentralized collective. That is interesting to me because it arguably directly conflicts with the tokens as currencies use case. Because for tokens as currencies, you want high velocity, you want this thing to be used in a lot of transactions. Yeah. Whereas if I'm your seed stage investor, you don't want me flipping that on secondary markets, right? Yeah. You want me to just like forget I even have that and just like work with you as a partner. So there's that tension. And I think that kind of third use case is what you're hinting at, right? Like as tokens as essentially jump ball equity, for lack of a better word, right? Right. And so this is where the legal side gets super interesting as well, because there's a long history of analyzing kind of units in a co-op as not being securities, right? So if securities are things where you primarily rely on the efforts of a promoter to deliver you value, and you're kind of a passive participant, that's a security, right? Whereas interest and co-ops, according to case law, have not been deemed securities so long as you allocate these interests based on essentially patronage in the network, and you have limitations on transfer, and kind of a bunch of other things relating to like how decision making is democratized and governance is set up in the right way. And so I think that there's a really, really interesting application of social tokens to kind of UGC-driven worlds where, as you were describing in the Roblox example, like you sometimes just get drawn to certain creators and what they're building, right? And you want to be part of a movement. And you get paid in the currency of that movement based on these like sub-communities that form. And whether like these things ultimately have value depends on the productive output of that community. There's a word for this, which is squad wealth, right? And squad wealth is kind of like, and this is where like you just really have to understand what's going on in consumer social broadly, right? Like there's this fascinating article that Sam Hart wrote about squad wealth, where he was talking about how the squad economy yields like primarily non-monetary forms of value. So when he described what squad wealth is, he said, it's when your Discord is popping off and it brings you more joy than a 70-hour-a-week hustle ever could, right? And everyone just wants to be a part of this thing, and they'll do anything to gain admission to the club, right? So you kind of tap into some of these exclusivity elements, but it's also just like, it's not that difficult to understand. It's like buying into a nice golf club with a high membership fee, right? And then doing things together that foster that group's identity and continues to create value as that squad, right? And so there is definitely a combination of UGC-driven content together with a fundamentally open architecture monetary policy and financial ecosystem that will serve as this really turbocharged incentive layer behind, I think, the next gen of UGC content. And I'm really excited to see it in things like, the equivalent of like D&D in digital space, right? Imagine like if we could like self-organize and as DMs, then like I could, I could buy into the DMs I really like, resonated with early on and kind of take a financial stake in the upside of that community, right? Things like that are really interesting.
Got it. Okay, well, I think there's a lot more we could dive into, and I know you have an essay. Well, you've got a post about 25 mini essays on social tokens. So I'll add a link to that post, and I think it'd be great if we could get you back on to talk through some of the finer details behind a lot of the concepts behind social tokens in the future. But Richard, I wanted to thank you for your time. Do you have a last message to our audience in terms of any references or first steps they should take when it comes to learning more about or potentially implementing, whether it's blockchain more generally or social tokens?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'd focus on NFTs first. I'll probably come out with a piece in the coming days on why I think NFTs are so fascinating and the implications on the creator economy generally. I think just in a word, the number one mistake people are making is they're viewing NFTs and digital art and digital collectibles as a purely financial instrument. And they're doing things like saying, oh, this is 2017 ICO bubble all over again. And I'm not saying prices aren't inflated. Prices are clearly like they've gone to the moon, right? Yeah. But the analogy, I think, is less helpful than useful because, let's just stipulate for a second that we're in an NFT bubble. The interesting question to me is, so what, right? Because tokens in 2017 were fungible promises, a means to some hoped for bigger ends, right? NFTs are non-fungible collectibles. And the reason that's important is because they're ends in and of themselves. So stripped to their core, tokens were driven primarily by extrinsic motivations, the idea of making money. Whereas NFTs and digital art, collectibles, are driven primarily by intrinsic motivations, or at least a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic. And so the reason that matters is, assume the bubble crashes and prices fall 50%, and some people lose money. What's left is going to be this core of more than just hope and expectation, but actually a fundamentally re-architected system through which creators can benefit individually rather than through entities. And that to me is the most interesting part of all of this, is this idea of cutting out the middleman, getting access to a global pool of buyers and sellers, having creatives be able to collect royalties every time their works are resold, combining the kind of social and utilitarian benefits of patronage with this possibility of earning a profit for doing what you love, right? And that is the most interesting part to me of how this can all go. And I would not be on the short side of the compounding effect of this mass of creatives all having come together at one time in a Schelling point, to use Alex Danko's term of it, this shared understanding and common gathering point for creatives and developers who for the first time can now represent digital scarcity in a commonly understood way. And that is just super exciting to me.
Right. And I would say like the example that you mentioned in terms of D&D, I think that's a really powerful one. It does feel like with a game like D&D that's fully digitized in some way on tablets and where you have the potential to have a lot of different dungeon masters as well as characters and items, that the potential application of blockchain, NFTs, and social tokens around different communities and dungeon masters, like it feels like someone could really figure that out, and that could be like the next big hit. But
totally, anyway. Yeah, and would love to kind of talk to like game developers all over and jam on this stuff, because I don't have all the answers, and I learn constantly from conversations with smart people. So yeah, we have a Discord for RNG, discord.gg/RNGlife. If you come in and introduce yourself, I'll send you 100 RNGs so you can experience what it's like to play with this stuff in real time and continue the conversation.
All right, great. All right, thank you for your time, Richard. And folks, until next time, I'll talk to you later. Bye.